Alright, how you guys doing this morning?
Good.
We're excited for fall break. Alright, so I'm Tim Bryant. I'll be talking to you guys a little bit about commercial seed production in the United States. So a few objectives. We're going to go through the history of seed production, how it came to be. Then we're going to go through some of the basic concepts of actual seed production, different types of seed, means of pollination, differences between annual and biannual crops, and then seed harvesting, cleaning, and storage. And then we're going to talk about some of the implications of that on American farmers. So just to get a little of the history of seed production in the United States, about 150 years ago, we actually didn't have any commercial seed production. So this is something that's relatively new, but today the United States has one of the largest productions. So in the 1850s, the U.S. Patent and Trade Office started distributing seed to their constituents around the country. This was basically, we had an expanding continent and they wanted to have a diverse amount of food that could support the entirety of the country. So along with that, seed exchange societies formed, which basically was trade throughout the world to bring seeds in from different places to create diversity here. And along with that, the U.S. Treasury issued a directive to collect plant material from all over the world. So the U.S. Navy, stationed in the Philippines and China and things like that, were bringing plants back to the United States to increase our diversity. And then the American Seed Trade Association was formed in 1883, and they basically lobbied for the privatization of the seed trade instead of the USDA's distribution. And then in the early 20th century, we had the first hybrid seeds emerging. And these, most of these came from land-grant universities, such as Virginia Tech, and a lot of them didn't want to allow their seed to be privatized because it was early research and they just wanted to maintain that. So then in 1924, the American Seed Trade Association finally convinced Congress to cut the USDA's seed distribution. So this kind of started small seed companies. They weren't very big, they were really localized, and there was a lot of them throughout different areas. And land-grant universities' role was reduced to training breeders as well as research instead of actually distributing the seed. So then in 1980 there was a Supreme Court case, Diamond versus Chakrabarty, which basically said that genetically modified seed can be patented and claimed as intellectual property. And this ruling kind of changed everything about seed production because companies that weren't even involved in seed production wanted to get into it. It allowed them basically to own the seed, which makes farmers come back every year, increase profits for a lot of them. So there was a major consolidation around that time, billions of dollars in acquisitions and mergers between companies and seed producers. So getting into a little bit of how they actually produce seed, there's a couple different types of reproductive categories in plants. There's self-pollinators and cross-pollinators. So basically self-pollinators, the male and female portions of the plant are on the same plant and it pollinates itself. And cross-pollinating plants rely on things like wind, insects, and animals to spread pollen to different plants. So we just got a couple examples here. Some self-pollinating plants is tomatoes, that's rice, soybeans, and wheat. And then cross-pollinating plants, we have onions, that's squash, celery, and corn. And that's just a few of the examples. There's obviously tons more. So means of pollination, cross-pollinating plants create genetic diversity when they mix with each other, just like when humans have kids, the genetic material gets mixed and creates different varieties. So when you have these types of plants, you have to be really careful about how you plant them so you get true to variety seed. So wind pollinators have to be planted in really dense blocks so that it makes sure every plant gets pollinated, and they can be self or cross-pollinating. Insect pollinating plants, you have to identify optimal pollinators for each type of plant. There's tons. Bees is an example right there. And they require less isolation than wind because insects don't travel as far as the wind does. The wind can move pollen up to 5 miles. And then self-pollinating species, isolation is mostly not a requirement for this because they usually don't interbreed and create that diversity. So we have annual crops, which are crops that seed in the first growing season. So examples here we have soybeans again, corn, squash, and potatoes. A lot of these examples are the same because they're major food crops in the United States, and it's really important to differentiate between whether or not they're annual or biennial. So then biennial crops require 2 growing seasons to produce seed, and this is because a lot of them need this period of vernalization, which is basically the plant needs a period of cold, about 45 degrees for an extended period, usually 1 to 2 months, and that allows for it to start flowering. So some examples of that, we have Brussels sprouts, onions, that's kohlrabi, and celery. So reproductive isolation is something you really have to worry about. Like I was saying before, you don't want your plants to interbreed because then you're not getting seed that's true to the variety you're looking for. So these are just some different methods to isolate your different varieties of plants. Isolation strips are rows of crops in between your actual seeding plants that are supposed to catch pollen and attract insects that you don't want to spread around to your different varieties. Distance isolation is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. This is really important for wind pollinators because the wind can move pollen up to like 5 miles, which can obviously cross species and you're not going to get the varieties you want. Caging and artificial barriers. They build PVC walls pretty much and put like mesh cloth over it, and this can block insects and pollen from reaching different crops. And then time isolation is planting crops at different times so that they're not flowering at the same time. So if you're working with annual crops, you might plant one in February and then another a couple months later so that they're not flowering at the same time and they won't interbreed. And then biannual crops, a lot of times they'll plant one, and then as the first one is flowering, they'll plant another. So they're growing all at the same time, but they're not flowering at the same time. So seed harvesting, labeling and keeping records is extremely important. You want to make sure, a lot of seeds look the same, you want to make sure you have them clearly identified so you're providing accurate information to your constituents, people you're selling the seeds to. So then harvesting methods, there's dry seed and wet seed, and basically wet seed is seed that's going to be inside of fruit. So you let the fruit over-ripen just a little bit and cut it, scoop out the seeds, and then what you're left with is this kind of like seeds mixed with a little bit of the pulp of the fruit. Dry seeds, for example, soybeans are just in seed pods and you just dry them out. So when you harvest seeds, you get a lot of stuff that you don't want. You get seeds that aren't viable, other parts of the plant like seed coatings, things like that. You want to get rid of all of that and just leave the seed. So this picture right here kind of shows there's a lot of difference in variety, like there's different sizes, colors, textures, all that. So there's a couple of different ways they separate seed. They got size, weight, shape, surface, texture, and color. And there's several different methods they use for some of these things. Color, they're basically doing that by hand. There's not a lot of technology that can identify different colors. Shape and surface texture, they basically use cardboard, and it's like rigid, and they put the seed on there, and round seed will fall down and roll off, and then flatter seeds and ones that are more rigid get stuck. And size and weight, they weigh seeds out. So dry seeds are in seed pods. For example, right here, there's some wheat. They're usually just dried out in open air and then smashed in what's called a threshing box, which is basically just like a 3x3, 2x4s like that with mesh on the bottom of it. It's like a metal screen pretty much. And they essentially just smash the seed into it and try to shake out all the stuff they don't want and just be left with the seed. So the seeds are then separated from the coatings and other parts of the plant that they don't want to have in there. And then wet seed is much more of an involved process. They're removed from slightly overripened fruit, like I was saying before, and they just simply cut open the fruit and scoop out the seeds. But most types of plants, the example here is tomatoes. They like a period of fermentation. So basically what they do is they take the seeds and the fruit pulp and put it in a container, just a regular plastic container, whatever you have, and they cover it, and it ferments and grows this mold on top, which I guess it absorbs nutrients into the seeds and allows them to be viable for a longer period of time. So this is kind of the final product of that. You can see the mold growing on it, and it's pretty gross, but that's it. And so after that, they're rinsed with like Clorox solution and water, and then dried for storage. So seed drying, it's going to be from 50 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty standard temperature. But the important part is you want a low relative humidity. So they can use things called desiccators, which are like, you see them in like food sometimes, like a jar of peanuts, it's like the little packet of stuff that keeps humidity low. And then they can also use dehumidifiers. That's kind of risky because sometimes they use high heat, which can make the seeds not viable. So you have to be really careful when using those types of things. So then storage, obviously you want airtight, low humidity, low temperature. This is all to avoid germination. So to store seeds, you need to keep them from germinating so they remain viable for longer periods of time. So seed banks use foil-lined heat-sealable envelopes like these right here. They have like hundreds of shelves of these, and a lot of plants can last for 5 to 6 growing seasons before they're no longer viable. So another important thing to remember is when you have seeds stored at low temperatures, you have to acclimate them back to room temperature before you open the packets they're in, because if you open it to room temperature and they're frozen, you're going to have condensation on the seeds, which is essentially going to make them not work anymore. So the implications of this type of seed production on American farmers, many farmers become dependent on these large seed companies because they own the genetic varieties. They have to keep going back year after year to buy the seed again. So like I said, companies have intellectual property claim on the seed, which allows them to file suit against any farmers who attempt to reuse or save their seed, which is a practice that has been used for a long time until that Supreme Court case that I was talking about, where they were able to claim intellectual property on genetically modified seed. And then everyone in the United States should have an understanding of how these companies control all the food that we eat today. There's a few large firms that own about 75% of seed production in the United States, and that's basically all of the food that we eat. So just to wrap it up, the history of seed production is a relatively short one when it comes to production in the United States. Can be traced back to a few key events. The seed production relies on firm knowledge of different types of plants and how they produce seed. So understanding how to clean and store every different type of seed is going to be really important for successful production. And then American farmers have serious reliance on this type of seed production on a major scale. So they have to keep going back year to year to provide a source of income. And there's my references, and that's it. Thank you.